The world of Zenith Innovations was a symphony of polished chrome minimalist design and the hushed hum of high-end servers. It was a space built to project an image of effortless genius and unyielding progress, a fortress of intellect where ideas were forged in silence and ambition was the only currency that mattered. At the heart of this gleaming cathedral of technology sat Marcus Thorne, a project manager of 26 with a mind as sharp as a scalpel and a focus as narrow as a laser beam. His domain was a sprawling open-plan office, but his universe was the 27 inches of his monitor screen. He was a man defined by efficiency, a believer in the purity of data, and a practitioner of a solitary brand of success that saw human interaction as a bug in the code of progress. His desk was a testament to this philosophy. A single perfectly aligned monitor, a keyboard and mouse of a specific ergonomic design, a notepad with a single complex algorithm scrawled on it, a masterpiece of logic and precision. The only splash of color was the muted green of a potted succulent, a plant so self-sufficient it required almost no care, a living metaphor for Marcus's own existence. At midday, as the rest of the company's employees migrated to the bustling sunlit cafeteria to eat and gossip, Marcus remained at his post. His lunch was a pre-packaged kale salad and a bottle of electrolyte water consumed with the same methodical focus he applied to his work. He didn't eat alone out of a desire for quiet reflection. He did it out of a calculated conviction that a lunch hour spent networking was an hour not spent innovating. He was a ghost in the machine, a brilliant mind that moved through the company's halls with an invisible grace. His colleagues saw him as distant, even cold, but Marcus didn't see it that way. He saw himself as dedicated. He was building his future one perfectly optimized project at a time. He had a singular goal to rise to the top, to become a director, a vice president, perhaps even CEO. He had no time for pleasantries, for small talk, for the messy, inefficient business of human connection. He believed that the work spoke for itself, that talent and hard work would in the end be the only things that truly mattered. His focus was absolute, so much so that he often failed to notice the people around him, a tendency that was both his greatest strength and his most glaring weakness. He saw them not as individuals, but as variables in a larger system, cogs in the corporate machine. He knew their job titles, their project deliverables, and their performance metrics. He did not know their names, their stories, or the quiet struggles they faced. To him, they were all data points, and he was the one who could interpret the patterns. It was this very mindset that led to a moment that on the surface appeared to be an act of unexpected kindness. A new intern, a young woman named Sarah, had been tasked with a complex coding problem. She was struggling, her face pale with frustration, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. A group of older, more experienced engineers were gathered around her, their voices a condescending chorus of suggestions and thinly veiled mockery. "Looks like someone can't handle the pressure," one of them sneered, another snorted with laughter. Sarah's eyes welled up, and she was on the verge of a public, humiliating breakdown. Marcus, who had been observing the scene from a distance, saw not a struggling intern, but a systemic problem. A public spectacle of this nature would reflect poorly on his department, a stain on their impeccable record of efficiency. It was a problem, and he was a problem solver. He rose from his desk and walked over to the group, a quiet, commanding presence that silenced the laughter. He didn't offer a platitude or a word of comfort. Instead, he looked at Sarah's code, his eyes scanning the lines with a terrifying speed. "You're trying to solve for X when UI is the core variable," he said, his voice flat and unemotional. "The entire algorithm needs to be rewritten to account for a different dependency loop. Try this." He quickly typed a new set of instructions, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a surgeon's precision. The code ran perfectly. The problem was solved. He didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't offer a pat on the back. He simply turned and walked back to his desk, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The other engineers, humbled by his effortless display of genius, slunk back to their desks. For them, it was an act of pure, unadulterated brilliance. For Marcus, it was a practical solution to an inefficient problem. It was a public save the cat moment, but the cat he saved wasn't Sarah. It was his department's reputation, and by extension his own. He was a hero in a vacuum, a man who did good things for all the wrong reasons. As the sun began to set, painting the windows of Zenith in a wash of fiery orange, the office slowly emptied. The brilliant minds and ambitious spirits packed up their laptops and headed home. But Marcus stayed. He had a problem. He was wrestling with a particularly thorny bit of code that was proving resistant to his elegant solutions. He worked late, the silence of the office now a welcome presence, a space where he could finally think without interruption. He was so engrossed in his work that he barely registered the quiet shuffle of footsteps behind him. It was the night janitor, a man named Liam. Liam was a fixture of the late-night office, an almost invisible figure who moved through the building with a quiet dignity. He was a small, wiry man in his early 60s with a face that was a roadmap of a hard-lived life and eyes that held an unexpected, almost unnerving depth. He didn't make small talk. He just did his job, a silent guardian of the company's cleanliness. As Liam reached Marcus's desk, he paused. He looked down at the notepad at the complex mathematical formula that Marcus had been agonizing over for hours. Marcus, lost in his own thoughts, didn't notice. Liam's eyes, however, a quiet, knowing blue, lingered on the equation for a moment longer than they should have. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod of recognition. A flash of something like intellectual curiosity. And then he moved on his cleaning cart, a soft rumble in the vast, empty space. Marcus, who had been staring at the screen, a look of fierce concentration on his face, never saw it. He was too busy looking for a solution in the numbers, a place where he always believed all solutions could be found. He didn't know that the answer he was looking for was right there, in the quiet, knowing gaze of a man he had never truly seen. He didn't know that the janitor was the architect of the very world he was trying so hard to conquer, a legend, in disguise a whisper of a secret that was about to turn his entire universe upside down. The silence of the night, once a sanctuary for Marcus's uninterrupted work, had become a prison. The code, a sprawling, intricate network of logic and dependencies, had a flaw, a single insidious bug that was resisting every elegant solution he threw at it. The problem wasn't just a line of broken code. It was a ghost in the machine, a rogue element that caused the entire system to falter in unpredictable, catastrophic ways. He had been at his desk for 16 hours straight, a record even for him, and all he had to show for it was a head full of static and a growing sense of dread. The air, once cool and sterile, now felt thick with the scent of burnt-out ambition. The real crisis, however, was not just the code. It was the impending visit from a major investor, a venture capitalist named Reginald Finch. Finch was not just a money man. He was a legend in the tech world, a man known for his brutal efficiency and a zero-tolerance policy for failure. He had been a key backer of Zenith Innovations from the very beginning, and he was flying in for a surprise inspection, an unannounced audit of their progress. His arrival, scheduled for the end of the week, was a sword of Damocles hanging over the entire project. The security protocol was Zenith's flagship project, the one that promised to redefine the industry. If it failed, the funding would be pulled, the project would be shuttered, and the brilliant, meticulous career Marcus had built for himself would come crashing down. The pressure was not just coming from the top, it was coming from within. Lena Petrova, a senior vice president with a predatory ambition, saw Marcus's crisis not as a shared problem, but as a golden opportunity. She was a woman who moved through the corporate hierarchy with the grace of a shark. Her smiles a mask for a deep and calculating ruthlessness. She had been vying for the CEO position for years, and she saw the potential failure of Marcus's project as a chance to publicly discredit him, and by extension, the current CEO who had championed him. She had a public meeting with Marcus, her voice dripping with faux concern. "I know you'll get this done, Marcus." She had said, her eyes cold and hard. "The board is counting on you. I've already told them that the deadline is non-negotiable. I've assured them that your team is the best in the business." It was a subtle, insidious form of sabotage, a public pronouncement that set an impossible standard and ensured that if Marcus failed, the fall would be even more spectacular. His team, a collection of brilliant but exhausted engineers, was no longer a resource he could rely on. They were burnt out, their morale shattered by the impossible deadlines and Marcus's demanding, impersonal style of leadership. He had always seen them as cogs in a machine, and now the machine was beginning to break down. Their collaboration, once a seamless process, had devolved into a series of resentful exchanges and passive-aggressive silences. He had tried to rally them with data, with charts and graphs, with impassioned pleas about the importance of the project, but they were no longer listening. They were just waiting for the inevitable collapse, a feeling that had settled over the department like a toxic fog. Marcus, in his own way, was also crumbling. His logical, data-driven worldview, once his greatest asset, was failing him. He was a man who believed in order, in the predictable elegance of an equation, but the bug was a chaotic, irrational force that defied all logic. He was a general who had lost control of his army, a composer whose symphony had descended into dissonance. He felt a growing sense of isolation, a fear that he was losing his grasp on the one thing that defined him, his control. He was standing on the precipice of a professional disaster, and for the first time in his life, he had no elegant solution, no clever fix, no brilliant line of code to save him. It was late, long after midnight. The office was quiet, save for the soft, methodical swish of Liam's broom. Marcus was staring at a blank screen, a look of utter defeat on his face. He was in his element, a place of solitude and intense thought, but the element was turning against him. He felt the weight of the project, of Lena's silent machinations, of his team's resentment pressing down on him. He felt the cold, hard reality of his ambition, an ambition that had given him so much, but had left him utterly alone in his moment of crisis. Liam, the quiet janitor, rolled his cleaning cart to the end of Marcus's row. He stopped and, without looking at Marcus, began to empty a nearby trash can. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost meditative. He was a silent, unassuming witness to the young man's despair. He had seen it before, this kind of intellectual paralysis, this breakdown of the ego. He had built this company on the backs of brilliant young minds, and he had seen many of them lose their way. After a few moments of this quiet observation, Liam spoke. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble laced with a heavy, unidentifiable accent. "Sometimes," he said, not to Marcus, but to the empty air, "you look at the whole house, not just the single brick that is falling." He said nothing more. He just pushed his cart to the next row, his broom continuing its quiet, rhythmic work. Marcus, who had been staring blankly at his screen, blinked. He had heard the words, but they made no sense to him. He was looking for a single broken line of code, not a house or a brick. It was a nonsensical interruption, a cryptic riddle from a man who was in his world, a complete non-entity. He dismissed it as the ramblings of a simple man, an irrelevant observation from a life that had nothing to do with the complex, high-stakes world of software engineering. But the words, for some reason, lingered. They were an unwelcome echo in the silence of his thoughts, a discordant note in the symphony of his despair. He tried to shake them off, to get back to the code, to the problem, to the single brick that he was so desperate to fix. But the words had planted a seed of doubt, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack in his carefully constructed worldview. He was at a point of no return. The old ways of thinking were failing him. His ambition, once a guiding light, was now a blinding fire. The fate of his project, his team, and his career now hung in the balance, a precarious, fragile thing that was about to be decided. He was alone, and he was losing. The quiet janitor had offered him a key, a subtle clue to a solution he couldn't yet see, and in his arrogance Marcus had thrown it away. But the words once heard could not be unheard. They were the ghost in his own machine now, a quiet whisper that was about to change the entire game. The office was a graveyard of ambition. The servers hummed a low, mournful tune, and the screens, once vibrant with the glow of innovation, were now a landscape of dark, defeated pixels. Marcus sat hunched over his desk, the silence a heavy physical presence that pressed down on him. He had been at it for hours, his mind a battlefield of fragmented data and broken code. The words of the janitor, the cryptic advice about looking at the whole house, had been an annoying echo at first, a distraction he couldn't afford. But as the hours wore on and the solutions failed to materialize, the echo became a whisper, a persistent, maddening question mark in his mind. He was on a video conference with his team in Tokyo, a last-ditch effort to find a bug in a remote server. The conversation was a tedious, frustrating affair. The language barrier was a chasm, and the subtle, nuanced technical details were being lost in translation. "No," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. "The dependency loop is not in the primary function. It's in the auxiliary protocol. We need to look at the tertiary firewall." The Japanese engineers, polite but clearly confused, nodded and smiled. "Yes, Mr. Thorne, we will look at the tertiary firewall." The call ended and Marcus slammed his hands down on the desk in a rare, furious outburst. He was a man who believed in a logical world, and the world of human communication was proving to be the most illogical of all. That's when he heard it. It wasn't the rhythmic swish of a broom or the soft rumble of a cleaning cart. It was the low, melodious cadence of a conversation in the hallway. Liam the janitor was on his phone. Marcus, his mind still reeling from the frustrating call, barely registered it at first. But then a word caught his ear. It was a technical term, a piece of jargon he had just used on the call, but Liam was saying it in perfect fluent Japanese. Marcus, his mouth slightly ajar, froze. He listened, his mind trying to make sense of the auditory anomaly. He heard Liam, his voice a quiet murmur, explaining a complex technical problem to someone on the other end of the line, his accent completely gone. The conversation shifted. Liam was now speaking in a fluid, confident German, his voice rising and falling with an almost theatrical grace. He was talking about a completely different project, a new form of data encryption. Marcus, who had studied German in college, understood enough to know that the man was not just speaking the language, he was thinking in it. The conversation ended, and after a brief pause, a new one began. This time, it was a rapid-fire Russian, a torrent of words that flowed from Liam's mouth with the ease of a native speaker. Marcus, now completely captivated, sat in a state of stunned disbelief. The man he had dismissed as a simple janitor, a silent, unassuming fixture of the late-night office, was a polyglot, a walking, talking United Nations of one. The final call was a masterpiece of linguistic dexterity. Liam spoke in Mandarin, his voice a low, commanding presence, and then after a brief pause he switched to a flawless, crisp Arabic. Marcus, who had always defined intelligence by a single, narrow metric, was now faced with a man who defied all metrics. The janitor, the man he barely acknowledged, was a genius. He had just heard him speak in 9 different languages, from the complex phonetics of Mandarin to the guttural elegance of Russian, and not one of them had sounded forced or rehearsed. They were all a part of him, a secret he wore as effortlessly as his janitor's uniform. The confrontation was not planned. It was a pure, unfiltered reaction. Marcus rose from his desk and walked into the hallway. Liam was just hanging up his phone, a small, benign smile on his face. He looked at Marcus, his eyes those quiet, knowing blue eyes holding a hint of amused recognition. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice returning to its familiar, heavily accented English. Marcus, his heart pounding in his chest, stammered, I heard you. You were speaking in 9 different languages." Liam shrugged a non-committal gesture. "A man must have hobbies," he said, his smile widening slightly. "My wife, she likes to travel. We practice." The explanation was ludicrous, an obvious deflection, and Marcus knew it. But he also knew with a sudden chilling clarity that he was out of his depth. He was a master of code, but the man in front of him was a master of the world. He was a master of concealment, a keeper of secrets. The janitor was more than he seemed, far more. Unbeknownst to either of them, the confrontation had a silent, unseen witness. Lena Petrova, who had been working late, had seen it all. She had heard the languages. She had seen the look of utter bewilderment on Marcus's face. She hadn't seen a simple janitor. She had seen a vulnerability, a crack in Marcus's armor, and a potential resource she could exploit. She had been digging into Liam's background, her suspicions piqued by his quiet dignity and her own ruthless paranoia. She had planted a discreet camera in the hallway, and it had captured every word, every nuance of Liam's multilingual phone calls. For her, the janitor was no longer a curious oddity. He was a key that could unlock Marcus's downfall and pave her way to the top. She saw a man who could be used, a secret that could be twisted, and a weapon that could be wielded against her rival. Marcus, however, saw only the mystery. He saw the janitor a man he had never truly seen, a man who had now revealed a piece of himself that defied all logic and reason. The arrogance that had once defined him was now replaced by a quiet, unsettling curiosity. He had always believed that success was a straightforward path, a linear progression of hard work and talent. But the janitor was a living testament to a different kind of success, a success that was hidden, unassuming, and profoundly, breathtakingly powerful. The revelation was a personal catalyst, a point of no return. His world, once a simple binary world of code and data, was now a world of secrets, of hidden truths, and of a quiet, unassuming legend who was about to change his life forever. The war room at Zenith Innovations was a fortress of glass and steel, a modern coliseum where reputations were made and careers were shattered. It was a perfectly designed space, a panoramic box that overlooked the entire city, its walls a translucent canvas for data streams and code. This was where the company held its most high-stakes meetings, its most critical presentations. It was a place of power, a symbol of the company's unyielding dominance in the tech world. For the annual Innovators Showcase, a public spectacle of the company's latest achievements, it was the perfect stage. And Lena Petrova, the cunning senior vice president, had ensured it would be the stage for Marcus Thorne's spectacular downfall. Lena's challenge had been a masterstroke of corporate manipulation. She had framed it as a public demonstration of Marcus's leadership and the strength of his project, a crucial show of confidence for the company's investors. But behind the scenes, her true motive was a cold, calculated desire to see him fail. She had been digging into Liam's past, and while she hadn't yet uncovered his true identity, she had found enough inconsistencies and anomalies in his background to confirm her suspicions. The janitor was not who he seemed. She planned to use this information to undermine Marcus, to expose his naivety in trusting an unknown entity. She had also, in her ruthless efficiency, planted a small, insidious bug in the server architecture, a piece of code designed to trigger a catastrophic system crash at the moment of the presentation's greatest triumph. The pressure on Marcus was immense. He was a man fighting on two fronts: the technical challenge of a bug he couldn't find, and the psychological battle against a rival who was working tirelessly to see him fail. Lena had successfully isolated him from his team. Their morale was shattered, their trust in him broken by his demanding, impersonal leadership style. When he asked for their help, they gave it grudgingly, their movements slow, and their eyes devoid of the passion that once fueled them. They were cogs in a machine he had designed, and the machine was now breaking down. He was alone, a general with a mutinous army, facing a battle he wasn't sure he could win. His only source of comfort, of genuine, unadulterated insight, was the quiet janitor. After his startling revelation, Marcus found himself seeking out Liam late at night. He didn't ask about his past or his languages. He just talked, pouring out his frustration, his fears, and his technical problems. Liam, in return, would offer cryptic, non-work-related parables and pieces of advice, a series of breadcrumbs that Marcus, in his state of intellectual and emotional turmoil, was finally beginning to pick up. "The best gardener," Liam had said one night, "does not pull the weeds himself. He teaches the other plants to grow stronger and choke them out." It was a lesson not about code, but about leadership, a lesson that was slowly, painfully beginning to sink in. The day of the Innovators Showcase arrived with the cold, hard finality of a death sentence. The war room was packed. Investors, board members, and all of Zenith's key personnel were there, their faces a mixture of anticipation and thinly veiled skepticism. Lena stood in a corner, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips, her eyes like a predator's fixed on Marcus. Jeremy "Jem" Carter, the veteran engineer who had always viewed Marcus with suspicion, sat in the front row. His arms crossed his face, a mask of judgment. He represented the old guard, the keepers of the company's original idealistic culture, and he saw Marcus as a threat to all of it. But the most important person in the room, the one with the final say, was the founder's representative. The founder, a reclusive figure known only as Julian Croft, had sent a stand-in, a man with a stern face and an impeccable suit. Marcus, however, didn't recognize him. He didn't know that the man in the impeccably tailored suit was a hired actor, a pawn in a game played by the real founder, Liam the quiet janitor, who was at that very moment standing at the back of the room, a silent witness in his janitor's uniform, observing everything. The time pressure was palpable, a ticking clock that was not just counting down to the presentation's end, but to the data breach that would destroy Marcus's project and his career. Marcus, isolated and on the brink, stepped up to the podium. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly, and began his presentation. He wasn't talking just about code anymore. He was talking about the team, about the collective effort, about the shared vision. He was speaking not with the sterile language of data, but with the halting, vulnerable language of a leader who had finally learned to be human. He was a man alone in a symbolic arena, a man whose only weapon was a newfound understanding of something far more complex than code. The showcase began a live, real-time demonstration of the new security protocol. The system was running smoothly. The data was flowing. It seemed for a brief, glorious moment that Marcus had pulled off the impossible. But the silence in the room was not one of victory. It was the tense calm before the storm. The bug, Lena's insidious bug, was a time bomb, and it was about to go off. Marcus, his eyes on the data streams, felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The game was rigged. He was a man in a symbolic arena, a warrior fighting a battle he had no idea he had already lost. The ultimate test was not whether he could fix the code. It was whether he could survive the inevitable public and spectacular failure that was coming for him. The war room was a tomb of anticipation. Marcus stood at the podium, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, watching the data streams of his project flow seamlessly across the glass walls. For 5 minutes, a tense, silent eternity, everything worked. The security protocol was flawless. The code was elegant. The project was a resounding success. A wave of relieved murmurs rippled through the room. Lena Petrova in her corner felt a prickle of cold sweat on her brow. Had her sabotage failed? Had Marcus somehow found and patched the bug she had so carefully placed? The thought was maddening. Then, with a sudden sickening jolt, it happened. A single data stream flickered, a red dot appearing in the corner of a meticulously designed user interface. Then another. And another. The entire system began to seize the elegant code on the glass walls, distorting into a garbled mess of red error messages. The main data flow sputtered, then died. A siren blared, a piercing electronic shriek that cut through the silence. The showcase, a moment of triumph, had become a catastrophic failure. A collective gasp swept through the room. Murmurs turned to shouts of disbelief. Lena in her corner couldn't contain a triumphant, cruel smile. Jeremy Carter, the veteran engineer, shook his head with a look of utter disgust. Marcus, standing at the podium, felt the blood drain from his face. The world, the career, the ambition he had built his entire life around was collapsing. He had no explanation. The failure was absolute, and it was public. He was a fraud, an incompetent leader, a man who had failed spectacularly in the most important moment of his life. The founder's representative, the stern, formal man, rose from his seat. His voice, when it came, was a cold, quiet blade. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "your system is compromised. We have a catastrophic failure. The integrity of Zenith Innovations is now in question. What do you have to say for yourself?" Marcus felt 1,000 eyes on him, 1,000 silent judgments. His mind, the brilliant machine that had once given him so much, was a complete blank. He could not find the bug. He could not explain the failure. He was staring into the abyss, and for the first time in his life he had no code, no data, no elegant solution to save him. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final humiliating verdict. This was the breathless moment, the instant when everything he had ever worked for was about to turn to dust. And then the founder's representative leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Marcus. His voice, now a low, conspiratorial murmur, was no longer in English. It was in a long, dead, obscure dialect of ancient Russian, a language Liam had used on the phone in the hallway that night. "В чем структурная целостность краеугольного камня?" he asked. What is the structural integrity of the keystone? The question was a test, a riddle, a final piece of the puzzle that only a man who had learned from the janitor could understand. The entire room was silent, baffled by the foreign words. Lena's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of confusion. Marcus, however, felt a sudden electric jolt of recognition. He didn't understand the language, but he understood the metaphor. He remembered Liam's words spoken to the empty air in the dead of night. Sometimes, you look at the whole house, not just the single brick that is falling. He remembered his own dismissive arrogance, his stubborn search for a single broken line of code. He looked at the chaos on the screen not as a random failure, but as a systematic collapse. The bug wasn't in the project. It was in the infrastructure. It was in the keystone. He took a deep breath, his hands no longer shaking. He looked directly at the founder's representative, then at Lena, and then at the bewildered faces of his team. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of a defeated man, but the voice of a leader who had finally learned to see. The keystone is not a single brick, he said, his words ringing out in the silent room. It is the entire foundation. The failure is not in our code. It is in the server architecture. A catastrophic vulnerability has been exploited. The entire house is compromised, not just the single brick. I believe the vulnerability was deliberately planted. The room erupted. People began to talk over one another, the shock giving way to a frenzied speculation. Lena, her face pale, began to make a frantic retreat, trying to melt into the crowd. But it was too late. The founder's representative, still in character, pointed a finger at her. "Security," he commanded. "Seal the room." The doors locked with an electronic click. The representative then looked at Marcus, and for the first time a small, knowing smile touched his lips. It was then that a second act of vengeance unfolded. The founder's representative turned to Lena, and in a loud, clear voice he spoke not in Russian but in perfect English. "Ms. Petrova, we have video evidence of you planting this vulnerability. We also have records of you digging into the private life of an employee, a man who, as it turns out, is the founder of this company. His name is Julian Croft." The room was silent. A hushed gasp, a collective intake of breath filled the air. The janitor, the quiet, unassuming man who had been a ghost in the machine, was a living, breathing legend. Lena's face, a mask of shock and terror, finally broke. She was a woman who had tried to build her empire on a foundation of lies and manipulation, and now that foundation was crumbling around her. The representative then looked at Marcus, his face now a portrait of quiet pride. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "you have not only saved this company from a catastrophic security breach, but you have also proven that a true leader is not just a master of code, but a master of human connection. The real test was not a matter of technology, but a matter of trust. And you, in the end, chose to trust the right man." The crowd, which had been silent with shock, finally erupted, not in jeers but in a thunderous applause. Marcus, the boy who had once been a shadow, was now the center of a roaring, triumphant light. The vindication was complete. He had lost his project, but he had won the war. He had lost his arrogance, but he had found his humanity. He had looked at the whole house, and in doing so, he had saved it. He was no longer just a brilliant mind. He was a leader, a hero, and a man who had finally learned the difference between a single brick and a keystone. The dust settled, but the echoes of the applause still vibrated through the silent war room. The glass walls, once a canvas for Marcus's failing project, now reflected the shocked and humbled faces of the company's elite. The silence was no longer the heavy silence of despair, but the quiet stillness that follows a seismic shift. The world as they knew it had been irrevocably changed. Lena Petrova, the ruthless manipulator, was gone. Her lies, her sabotage, her carefully constructed facade of competence had been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow, pathetic shell. She was publicly disgraced, her career in tatters. The company, under the founder's explicit instruction, had immediately begun the process of her termination, a proportional punishment for a crime that was not just against Marcus, but against the very integrity of Zenith Innovations. Jem Carter. The veteran engineer was a man transformed. He had watched the entire spectacle unfold, a look of judgment on his face, turning to one of dawning shame and finally to one of profound respect. He had seen the quiet janitor, the unassuming man he had never once acknowledged, reveal himself to be the architect of the very world he had so fiercely protected. He had seen Marcus, the arrogant tech bro he had so quickly dismissed, not only save the company, but do so with a newfound wisdom and humanity. He found Marcus later that evening alone in the now empty war room, staring out at the city lights. Jem, a man of few words, walked over and simply stood beside him. "Marcus," he said, his voice gruff but sincere, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you. I judged you based on what I thought I knew, and I missed the truth. You're a leader, not just a manager. I'm sorry." The apology was more than just words. It was a surrender, an admission that the old guard had a thing or two to learn from the new. But the most profound change came from the man himself, Julian Croft. He had shed the disguise of Liam the janitor and was now standing in his true form, a man of quiet power, a legend who had been hiding in plain sight. He walked over to Marcus, a warm, genuine smile on his face. "Marcus," he said, his voice now crisp and clear, devoid of the heavy accent. "You did well. You could have saved the company, but you did more than that. You saved yourself. Marcus, humbled by the entire experience, simply nodded. I didn't know, he said, his voice a quiet whisper. I didn't know you were the founder. Julian laughed, a rich, full sound that filled the room. That was the point, he said. I wanted to see who would lead when they thought no one was watching. I wanted to see who had the courage to see the truth even when it didn't fit the narrative. You have the mind, Marcus. A mind that can see patterns in the chaos. But you were missing the heart. You were so busy looking at the code that you forgot to look at the people. Julian then made him an opportunity that was not a reward, but a test. I am retiring, he announced. But before I do, I want to leave this company in the right hands. I would like to offer you a new position, not as a project manager, but as my personal protege. I want you to work under me for a year. I want you to learn to lead with empathy, to understand that a company is not a system of numbers and algorithms, but a family of people with stories and struggles. I want to teach you to see the entire house, Marcus, and not just the single brick that is falling. The offer was staggering, a chance to work with a legend, to learn not just the business, but the humanity of it. Marcus, a man who had once been driven by pure, unfiltered ambition, now saw a different path, a better path. He accepted his heart, filled not with the thrill of a promotion, but with the quiet promise of a true and meaningful purpose. He and Julian had a long, reflective conversation that night, a conversation that stretched long into the pre-dawn hours. Julian told him stories of the company's early days, of the struggles, the victories, and the people who had built it. He told Marcus that the janitor had been his way of staying grounded, of seeing the truth from the bottom up, of ensuring that the company never lost its soul. He told him that the languages were just a hobby, a way to connect with the world, a testament to the belief that every person, no matter their background, had a story worth hearing. Marcus, a man who had once believed in the purity of logic and the finality of data, was now faced with a new reality, a world where the most important lessons were not found in a line of code, but in a quiet conversation with a man who had for so long been a silent ghost in the machine. The resolution was not a grand victory, but a quiet, profound beginning. It was the moment Marcus realized that he had not just won a battle, but had found a purpose, a new calm, that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of meaning. 5 years later, the world of Zenith Innovations was a living, breathing testament to the quiet wisdom of its founder. The glass walls of the war room still overlooked the sprawling city, but the space no longer felt like a coliseum. It felt like a crossroads, a place where ideas were born, not through competition, but through collaboration. And at the heart of this new, revitalized Zenith sat Marcus Thorne, no longer a young, arrogant project manager, but a senior leader, a mentor, and a man who had finally found his soul. He was a different person, a man who had traded his pursuit of sterile efficiency for the rich, complex reward of human connection. The impeccably clean desk was now a canvas of life, a dog-eared book on philosophy, a framed photo of his wife and 2 young children, and a well-loved mug filled with coffee, a gift from Julian Croft himself. He had learned from the master not just the intricacies of corporate strategy, but the profound, simple truth that a company is not a machine, but a family. He had learned to see the people behind the code, the stories behind the data, and the humanity behind the ambition. His success was no longer measured in promotions or titles, but in the trust of his team, the respect of his colleagues, and the quiet pride of Julian Croft, who had finally retired, leaving his legacy in the most capable hands. His greatest accomplishment, however, was not a project or a promotion. It was an initiative. He had founded a mentorship program he had called the Keystone Initiative. In honor of the lesson he had learned, he had created a program that paired senior leaders with young, ambitious employees, not to teach them the how of business, but the why. He taught them that true leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about knowing how to ask the right questions. He taught them that empathy was not a weakness, but the single most powerful tool in a leader's arsenal. He was paying it forward, a simple, profound act of gratitude that was also, in its own way, an act of creation, a promise to ensure that no one else would have to learn the hard lessons he had learned in the dead of night. The old guard, like Jeremy Carter, were now his most fervent allies. Jem, no longer suspicious, was Marcus's right-hand man, a wise and trusted advisor who had come to see the new generation not as a threat, but as the future. The two of them, the old and the new, worked in perfect harmony, a testament to the power of a single moment of humility and a lifetime of shared purpose. The story ends late one night in the quiet, empty war room. The city lights twinkled below a sea of a million different stories. Marcus was not working. He was talking. Across from him sat a junior engineer, a young woman with a look of exhaustion on her face, the same look Marcus had once worn. She was struggling with a complex problem, a bug she couldn't find, a deadline she couldn't meet. Marcus listened, his gaze not on her work, but on her. He saw the passion, the drive, the quiet desperation that was so familiar to him. He didn't offer a solution. He just offered a cup of coffee, the same kind he had once received from a man he had never truly seen. Sometimes, Marcus began, his voice a low, warm murmur. You look at the whole house, not just the single brick that is falling. The intern's face, a mask of frustration just moments before, began to soften. A light flickered in her eyes, a dawning realization that the answer she was looking for was not in the code, but in a different way of seeing the world. The legacy of Julian Croft, the quiet janitor. The legend in disguise lived on in the heart of a new leader and in the spirit of a new generation. The story ends with the quiet certainty that the cycle of mentorship of humanity and of a truly meaningful kind of success would continue, a second spring blooming in the heart of a cold and sterile world. If this story stirred your heart, if it reminds you that true leadership is found in empathy and that every person has a story worth hearing, please leave a comment. Share this story with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss our upcoming stories.